Hello and welcome to the Womb-Centered Healing Podcast. I'm Sama Morningstar and I have with me here Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. Again, thank you so much, Lisa, for coming on. Lisa is the author of this wonderful book, The Fifth Vital Sign. I know it's backwards, but brain around and see that it says the fifth vital sign. I love this red calla lily here. Or maybe there's a different name for that lily, but it's just gorgeous on your book. And the contents of the book are so important and so sadly lacking from most people's awareness. I talk with women all the time, and I want to thank you and give credit to the title of your book, The Fifth Vital Sign, because I talk with women all the time about how our menstrual cycle is a vital sign, just as important to pay attention to as our heart rate or our blood pressure, or any of those things. And so, and this is an awakening for women. And it's, even though I've been doing womb-centered healing for, several decades, it's only becoming central in my life most currently the last few years of how important it is to pay attention to my cycles. Before that, it was just like, oh, I want to make sure I'm not pregnant. Right? But now it's like every little detail is like, oh, what is it telling me about my overall health?
Yes.
Regardless of my fertility, that's been important my whole life, but wait a second, what's it telling me about the rest of whatever is going on in my body and how central that is? And not just my body, but my emotions and my spirit. It has so much to say. My menstrual cycle has so much to say about that in the little nitty-gritty details. And so I'm constantly coaching women to really track, really pay more attention. I knew that was important, again, for fertility awareness, right? But for everything else too. And so recently I talked about in my blog how women are bleeding too much. And this is a common thing that I hear when I do these womb wellness assessments, that women are bleeding a lot. And this needs to be, and it's often ignored by doctors, or women are put on birth control to stop it, mostly because they say it's inconvenient. They're not saying that it's a health detriment unless you're anemic, and then you just take, and so it's like, oh, there needs to be more information about this. And so I said, who do I need to talk to about this? Guess who I thought of? Love for you to weigh in on this topic and how you feel about it, what the research is that says what the normal amount, healthy amount for women to be bleeding each month, because you can bleed too little as well. I've had plenty of clients that have that. And what some of the remedies that you've found or that you feel confident about. We can discuss that. And then the role, we'll get to the role of trauma in all of this as well, because we can certainly tie those two things together. But first, let's hear what you have to say.
First of all, thank you for having me back. It's always fun to be invited back. Mm-hmm. It means that our first conversation was interesting enough for us to have another one. So thank you for that opportunity. Mm-hmm. And so, the topic of bleeding, it's important. I think it's important for so many reasons. One of the most important reasons is because as women, we're not really told about what's normal when it comes to bleeding. And even if you're talking with your friends about your periods, which isn't something that necessarily happens a lot, in my experience, unless you're me and working in this field, or you, even if we feel pretty open about it, it's not something that we're really talking about. So what I always say to my clients, so in my group programs, in my one-on-one programs, I'll often do a demonstration where I actually do like a cup of red water, dyed red, and to illustrate what normal looks like, because as women, we typically only see our own periods, and so we often just assume that whatever we experience is typical, and everyone must be experiencing the same thing. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily true, obviously. Mm-hmm. So it's helpful to know that a normal period typically lasts anywhere from about 3 to 7 days. And so on average, about 4 to 5 days. What's normal in menstruation is for your period to start out moderate to heavy and generally follow kind of like a decrescendo kind of pattern where it starts out moderate to heavy. You end up losing the most blood over the course of your period during days 1 and 2, and you've lost about 90% of the total blood loss by day 3 is what the research tells us. And I think most women who've experienced menstruation will kind of nod their heads and say, yeah, there's usually a couple of days at the beginning where you're actively bleeding. And then once that stage is over, it typically does decrease and stop. So what's not typical would be, stopping and starting over multiple days. So it's possible for you to bleed a little bit during the day and maybe it pick up a little bit in the evening, but typically not stop for 3 days and then start again type of thing. If your cycle is less than 3 days, so if you bleed 1 or 2 days, that's outside of what we would consider normal. If you're bleeding for, over a week and or you continue having bleeding or spotting throughout the better part of your cycle, that's something that we should really know that that's outside of what we would consider normal. Mm-hmm. And the amount of bleeding, so it's interesting because the research gives us a lot of insight, but it's not by any means perfect. Some of the research studies don't necessarily qualify if a woman's on the pill or not, because what she's experiencing isn't a true menstruation. So, should we be counting that towards what we would consider a normal period? But what's considered to be normal, so on average, about 40 to 50 milliliters of bleeding is about average. So I would say that's somewhere around 2.5, maybe 3 ounces would be the average. And on the lower end, what would be considered normal would be about 25 milliliters of bleeding or more. And I think that's an important point as well. I know that your blog was titled Women Are Bleeding Out. So focusing on the fact that so many women do have really heavy bleeding. But what's interesting, because you mentioned it as well, I've worked with a number of women who have very light bleeding. And so to put it into perspective, if you're a menstrual cup user, on the light end, typically most menstrual cups hold about an ounce or so. And so over the course of all of the days of your period, you would expect to fill at least 1 cup and or, soak. So depending on the size of pad or tampon, on average, a full pad or tampon might hold 5 milliliters of bleeding. If it's like a really big one, it might hold up to 10. But, you're filling 3 to 4 pads or tampons throughout the course of your whole period. That would be like the light side. And then the heavy end, what the top is consistently in the research is about 80 milliliters of bleeding. And so that, from a menstrual cup perspective, over the course of your whole period, you're filling, 4 or 5 menstrual cups or more. And or throughout the course of your period, you're filling, 4 to 5 pads or tampons a day for several days. So that would be the heavier end. And just to give a little context, the reason that they put the cutoff at 80 milliliters, 4 to 5 ounces, is that women who tend to bleed more than that do typically end up having issues with iron. For example, they might be more likely to have iron deficiency anemia. And heavy bleeding is also associated with certain conditions. So for example, women with fibroids are more likely to have heavier bleeding, some cases of uterine polyps or endometriosis. And so if you regularly bleed a lot, then it would make sense, even if your practitioner hasn't asked about it, or even if your practitioner kind of minimizes it, it's not a bad idea to ask for a checkup. It would make perfect sense to have an ultrasound just to make sure that everything's fine, and just to do a full check just to make sure that there aren't any physical issues that could be related to this bleeding. Mm-hmm. And it was interesting when I was looking at the research, because there were some researchers that were even arguing, okay, maybe we shouldn't even wait till it gets to 80 before we're looking at it as a problem. Maybe we should, call it at 60 milliliters, because again, the heavier bleeding, if you're losing more blood, if you have a greater degree of blood loss, it is increasing your chance of having issues with your iron stores. So if you're bleeding a lot, you should definitely regularly have your iron stores checked. And also there's an inverse relationship where if you are really low on iron, you may end up bleeding more as well. So it's kind of like this cycle of bleeding.
Right.
So I'll pause there and let you jump in.
Right, because I'll just to say a little bit more about that inverse relationship, because the iron is a nutrient that helps our muscles. If you think of it as something that's heavy and dense, as we know iron is, it help and strong, right? It's used to make tools and to move things and like that. That's how it functions in our body. It helps our muscles to be strong, to move things, to close off and create structure, right? And so that's what we need to do to stop the bleeding from happening. The muscles of the womb need to be able to close off those blood vessels and hold them closed. And if we don't have enough iron, then that musculature cannot provide that kind of structure of saying, know what, we're not going to bleed anymore. And so as we lose more blood and more iron, we're less able to create that structure in our musculature. So I just wanted to say that. And I also wanted to say that it sounds like you looked at a wide variety of research. And there's a lot of information about this that hasn't been codified in official scientific research with doctors and scientists in labs or anything like that, because menstruation typically has not been something that's been well funded and that hasn't had a lot of those scientist types really interested in it. I'm impressed with the amount that you managed to drum up for your book. Because that's not been a big priority in medical research over the years. In fact, I heard on your podcast for the first time that women were actually excluded from medical research up into the 1990s.
Because we're complicated. We've got this whole menstrual cycle thing that makes it all so much more complicated. So even a lot of medications to this day are tested primarily on male bodies.
Right.
And up until recently, for example, men and women present very differently with heart attacks. So, men present in a very specific way, and for years, doctors were trained that this is what you need to look for, but women present in a completely different way, and so many women then were having heart attack symptoms because they didn't present as, this is like, why didn't we know this before? And to this day now, doctors are, being trained on that, but yeah, there's a lot of problems with the lack of information. But the good news, though, is that we are at a very interesting time when it comes to research. So of course, there's studies I want to do. I'm like, am I going to have to go back to school and get my PhD so I can get this research done? But there is a ton of research. And I think that was something that did surprise me, similar to your sentiment. Mm-hmm. Because then the question becomes, if there is so much research, like obviously we need to do more. And obviously there's so much more research that we could be doing about menstruation, mm-hmm. but there is a ton of research about it. Mm-hmm. So then the question becomes, like, if there's so much research, why don't we know about, why isn't this being talked about?
Why don't the doctors have this information? I've heard huge variations in what women are being told when they go to their doctor about this. And like you were mentioning, it's minimized when women are, come in with something about their bleeding. I think societally, there's this whole attitude of when women are complaining about their bleeding and some symptoms that they're having, that we're just supposed, they're making a problem out of nothing.
Well, yeah. And one thing that I just thought of when I was going through the research, so what I shared with you is what we would consider to be the normal parameters, mm-hmm. but that's by no means the absolute parameters. So there were research studies quoting women losing over 500 milliliters of bleeding, mm-hmm. Associated with conditions like fibroids or issues with uterine polyps or things like that. And so, the title of your article, you know, are women bleeding out? It's really important just to have that sense of what's normal. And so many women will bleed more than that 80 milliliters. So for example, when I run group programs and I share this information and I do a session where we go through and I do like the visual, I love doing visual stuff because it just sticks better in our minds. But when I do things like that, there's, you know, often a woman who bleeds way more than that. And, you know, I'll go through how much bleeding on a heavy cycle you can have throughout the whole cycle. And she's like, well, I bleed that much in one day. And then you have other women that are like, I had no idea women bled that much. That's insane. I just never even thought that that was a thing. And so these conversations are important for so many reasons, but it's important to know. So women who have really heavy bleeding, if we take it back to the menstrual cycle, beyond the period, the whole cycle, and think about what's happening hormonally. So, you know, in the first half of the menstrual cycle, that's when our ovaries are making estrogen. Estrogen is a proliferative hormone and it stimulates the growth of the endometrium. So when we have our periods, we're shedding the functional layer of our endometrium and we're essentially starting from scratch. And so when you start your cycle and your ovaries start producing estrogen as you prepare for ovulation in the first half of your cycle, that's stimulating the endometrial growth. And then the second half of the cycle, after we ovulate and after we start making our progesterone, that's what is then maturing the lining and preparing it for a fertilized egg. And so when you have a healthy cycle that falls into normal range, and on average, a woman's cycle is about 29 days. And so in that average cycle, you'll notice I'm saying average and like trying to emphasize average because every woman's cycle is not 28 days. But in that average cycle, you have the days of estrogen that are being offset by the days of progesterone. So you have somewhat of balance. One of the things that is important to keep in mind is that if you're having excessively heavy bleeding, that can be a sign of excess estrogen or an imbalance of estrogen and progesterone, because again, estrogen is what causes the uterine lining to grow and to proliferate. Mm-hmm. And so, for example, it's interesting that heavy bleeding is associated with fibroids. Fibroids are a condition that's associated with estrogen dominance, associated with having a lot of estrogen in our bodies, maybe where our livers aren't clearing it sufficiently, or maybe we have extra long cycles, meaning an extra long pre-ovulatory phase. And so those are, to know what's happening hormonally, it's helpful to just have that basic understanding of, okay, what's happening hormonally, what are the main hormones, what are their roles, and how could this be affecting my period bleeding?
You know, and you're talking about just the hormonal balance, which is really important. Of course, we always know this is a hormonal thing. And there are other aspects to our health that are involved in this. For example, with fibroids, that can also be a sign of excess mucus that then gets sort of packaged up and stored away in a fibroid. That's one understanding that I've learned about. I don't know that there's research about that. And what I was trying to get to too about that discussion about the kinds of research that you're finding, there's a lot of information from practitioners outside of the scientific research realm, like herbalists, midwives, vaginal steam practitioners who have worked with loads of women and gotten information. Kelly Garza of Steamy Chick is one that I look up to a lot for answering questions, because she's worked with so many women and has been quite rigorous in keeping information and looking at that information and saying, what happens when we actually give effective therapeutic herbs and practices to women to help regulate this? What happens when their health, the health of their menstrual cycle, is actually optimized? Yeah. And that's a completely different set from the research that you're talking about. Is like, what's the average on women that aren't doing anything really to optimize their health? But what's the average, right? And we have way over here in the extreme of too much bleeding, we have these. And so then we kind of get who's in the middle and what's that middle zone, right? But that's not people that are doing anything to fortify themselves or heal whatever might be going on that their womb is telling them about, right?
Well, I think that's, I mean, what you're describing is also what can be challenging about general lab ranges. So when you go in for testing, and I mean, iron is an interesting example of that, depending on where you live or the particular lab that you use, you can get a test result and you can see that the range can be like 5 to 200. So for example, in one of the studies that I quoted, that I was looking at for the menstrual cycle bleeding, the amount of bleeding, I think the study's name is like, can we reach an agreement about the Blake? That's obviously not the like word for word, but the name of the study was something like that, like, can we reach a consensus about how much bleeding is normal? That was essentially the title. And what's interesting is the absolute range of normal that they listed on that study was 5 to 80 milliliters. And they had to select 80, not because 80 is the top by any means of the range of all of the people, as you mentioned, regardless of their health status, but 80 was because that's at what point you could have a legitimate problem. So that's when you could start having this anemia problem. So we have to cap it at 80 because, there's a clear medical kind of issue there.
Right.
But it was from 5. So 5 milliliters means that over the course of your entire period, you would fill 1 tampon. And so when you mentioned the research and how it interplays with how, how I came to those numbers, there is a difference between the absolute population range and a range that would be considered to be healthy.
Yes, so the difference I wanted to articulate is the difference between what's normal in our current society, where there's shame and trauma around menstruation, where we're trying to sweep it under the rug, ignore it, bypass it, not really pay attention to it, and the range that happens within that context.
Yep.
And that affects all the different women in all the different ways. And so what's normal in that context? And then what emerges as normal within a population of women that are seeking nourishing, beneficial healing practices and are implementing nourishing, beneficial healing practices specifically about their menstrual cycle and are looking to have the healthiest menstrual cycle. When you look at that population, the normal becomes very different. The normal becomes more like 4 days maximum of bleeding every month. Those last, 3 or 4 days of trailing spotting tend to disappear. And as women are doing these healing practices, that's not necessary anymore for the womb to keep trailing off like that. And various other things start to narrow in to what's a healthy cycle look like. And that's what I often talk about with my clients. So I just wanted to clarify that, the distinction between what your research is showing and why I say to my clients all the time, what's a healthy cycle look like? And I'm curious what your thoughts on that are.
Well, I think that, I've heard people describe it being like health ranges versus sick ranges, when you're talking about lab ranges and things like that, because there is this absolute, so the way that things are described from that scientific context, if you are looking at a population and you do derive the range based on what's happening in the population, and obviously that population does include people who are actually sick and who are not, and so then you just have this big range and then you create a range out of that. And so the easiest example, one of the easiest examples would be thyroid and the TSH range, which if you go to a lab and you have a doctor test your TSH level, the range on the lab is typically 0.5 to 4.5 for the TSH level. And so, the doctor may only say anything if you go over that 4.5. And then immediately if you get pregnant, the range magically changes. The upper limit is 2.5. And if you're working with a functional practitioner, they're trying to get you more between like 1 and 2. So there is a difference between, even to refer to it as a functional range versus the overall range. The one challenge that I find, and you may have found this as well, because I work in the realm of menstrual cycles and I've done a lot of this research, and we're often talking about these parameters and what's normal, is that many women start to really freak out if one of the parameters of their menstrual cycle isn't hitting that range. So, so for example, I'm looking at the period between 3 to 7 days. So, I've worked with clients who have periods that are 2 days. I've worked with clients that have periods that are 7 days and 8 days. And and yes, what you're saying, like, is it possible that, 4 days or 5 days would be the absolute? And what I would say is that when it comes to menstrual cycle issues, I encourage my clients to take a step back from any one particular cycle and any one particular parameter and look at the whole cycle in its entirety. So the period is one aspect of the cycle, which obviously is very important. And so when we're looking at the length of the period, how much bleeding that there is there pain? Is there bleeding at other times in the cycle? So that's one parameter, and within that parameter, there's a lot of subpoints. Then we would look at the length of the entire menstrual cycle. So from period to the day before your next period, average 29 days, absolute range 24 to 35, functional range, arguably 27 to 32 days. But I suppose it's just because of the work that I do that I think it's really important to have this general understanding, and not have the goal to have this perfect cycle, air quotes, perfect cycle.
Right.
And I find that, because you may find this too, but a lot of women really start to stress if some of their parameters are off. So, breaking the menstrual cycle down in a healthy cycle, then ovulation would have to take place at some point between, say, days 10 and 23 in order for the cycle to fall within that 24 to 35 day cycle. And then the second half of the cycle, the luteal phase, have to be about 12 days. And so what I share with my clients is that, let's say, for example, that you're charting your cycles, and let's say that you have one cycle where you've got this wonky period, it lasts for 5 days, and then you've got trail end spotting for 3 days. But it's usually not like that. You just have this one period that's kind of like that. And let's say that outside of the period, though, the majority of your cycle parameters fall into normal. You don't have any extreme PMS symptoms. Overall, you're fairly good, except you had this really wonky period that one time. I think you can see where I'm going with this.
Yes, and that's what I talk with my clients about too, because I have encountered that, where as soon as I say, this is the healthy norm, and we're going to work with some vaginal steaming, with some herbs to support you to move towards that healthy norm. I talk with my clients, and if like you say, they have a whole bunch of those challenging symptoms where it's not just trail end bleeding to 7-8 days, it's actually full blown the same amount of bleeding as on day 1 and 2 that keeps coming back, then that's more of an urgent sign that, they're losing too much blood. Whereas that trail end bleeding, you're not really losing too much blood, but it may be a sign. And this is where it comes in as a vital sign that, might be more urgent, flashing red lights, or it might be a little bit something maybe to pay attention to, because it could turn into something bigger down the way, right? And so that's where we can have, like, I don't know exactly the word, but that stepped back, look at it and say, okay, what kind of sign is this? Is this like, urgent, or maybe this is something to attend to gradually and gently.
Well, and one of the important aspects of charting that I share with my clients regularly is that if you actually have an underlying health condition, so the menstrual cycle gives you a window into your health and a window into what's happening. And so if you have a health challenge, you have a health challenge. You know, if you have a health challenge, it's not just going to be one random cycle that's wonky. If you have a health challenge, it'll consistently show up. So I always encourage my clients to look for patterns. One weird menstrual cycle is not enough to get my alarm bells going. One delayed ovulation, one short luteal phase, a little bit of spotting, you know, mid-cycle, that you want to pay attention to it. But what I found is you really want to look for those patterns, because I've, you know, personally, I've charted my cycles for almost 20 years, and professionally, I've been working in this field for just as long. So every woman who charts her cycles for any length of time will inevitably have a wonky cycle, whether that's an early ovulation, a later ovulation, a shorter luteal phase, some spotting at some point. You know, every woman, if she charts her cycle long enough, will experience something random. And so one of the challenges with teaching women to chart in such a very specific way, there's a whole methodology for charting mucus in the way that I teach, and it can be very granular. So one of the challenges is using that information as a tool, but not being strangled by it, not feeling like it has to be this way, and the cycle always has to be perfect, and oh my goodness, I usually have 27-day cycles, but this time it was 32 days, like everything must be wrong. And so this is why I would say that it is helpful to talk about the ranges that I do. And I know some practitioners would say, no, it's the functional range of a total length, a normal cycle, 27 to 32 days. But for me, I'm more comfortable saying 24 to 35 days, because you probably will have a cycle that falls in that range. And maybe it's because you had a family emergency and they were stressed out and da-da-da-da-da. So we can't look at this and say, this definitely means that you have a health issue.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, so there's a balance there. So that's my response. I would say there's definitely a balance. It's important to understand these things, but there's no such thing as a perfect cycle, because our cycles are constantly in communication with our bodies. And as things change, as we get older, you know, at some point we're all going to hit the premenopause years, the 10 years before our last period. And during that time, it's very common for cycles to shorten, ovulation to happen earlier, and or cycles to lengthen. We can't assume that everything is a problem, but we have to understand what to look for to identify if it is a problem or not. And I would say that is consistent patterns.
Mm-hmm. Right. And I'm glad you brought up the thing, well, there might have been a family emergency or some kind of a stress or even a traumatic circumstance that when we're tracking and we notice, for example, that month my cycle was really short, or that period of months when this or that big stress event was going on, or we were recovering from that stress event, look what happened to my cycle. And then we start to realize how much stress influences our overall health, and how if that stress were to continue, which a lot of people's lives do have chronic extreme stress, and that's just considered normal, makes it understandable how it becomes normal that women are bleeding too much on a regular basis, and they're under so much stress all the time that they can't even pay attention to that. And then it ends up with a health problem down the line over the years. And so bringing that stress factor into the equation, I feel, is a big part of the picture and an important thing to look at. And it lets us know how stressful sometimes a situation was, because we might just have all this bravado and no, it's fine, I'm getting on with it. But then we see that it actually had an effect. I mean, myself, I tend to have short cycles, and I tell people that I think it's from a generational fatigue that my cycle just doesn't really make it to that full length. And I went on a trip overseas recently, and that was the shortest cycle I'd seen in a really long time. Even though it was a lovely trip, I had a lovely time. I made it really gentle and easy on myself. I set everything up ahead of time. There were no weird glitches. Well, I did end up waiting a long time at the airport in London, but there was nothing, really stressful about it. It was a very nourishing trip. And I still had a very short cycle and had a very intense menstruation while I was there. And there were other reasons for that too, but it just made me see, oh, but does that mean I'm never going to travel again? No, but it does mean that I'm going to take extra good care of myself and really, and know that because I saw that pattern, it doesn't mean that I have a huge problem and I'm never going to travel again. What it does mean is that I know that traveling can be fatiguing and a tax on my system. And so that gives me that information. And if I listen to that, then I know I'm going to take extra good care of myself. I'm going to make sure I have lots of nourishing herb teas. I did actually take a lot of nourishing herb teas on that. I got inspected at the airport. Oh my goodness. They thought
that must have been interesting. Well, I think you bring up such an important point, because I feel like women, I mean, in general, there's so many opportunities for us to become disconnected from our bodies and from our cycles. We live in a culture that celebrates objectification of female bodies, but not necessarily women, you know, in our entirety, with our cycles, with our ability to bear children, and for that to be celebrated, and also for that aspect, our cycles, not to exclusively be related to our ability to bear children. You know, it's our cycles are often just reduced to that, as if they don't play a role in any other way. So for a lot of women, connecting with their cycles, charting really gives them that opportunity to actually connect with that part of their body. And for many women especially women who've been disconnected, as you mentioned, for trauma, if they've experienced trauma, or if they associate with their cycles or their bodies, or just in general, because they've been on hormonal birth control for so long that they don't even know what their cycle would be like and have no idea what that would even feel like. For many women, they come into charting or they start paying attention to their periods or their cycles for a variety of reasons. But what ends up happening is that it is the thing that actually helps you to reconnect to your body and to actually start the way I think of it is you're starting to enter into a conversation with your body. So I always say, you know, your body can't talk to you in words. You know, if you're not getting enough sleep, your body can't be like, Lisa, get to bed. But if you start charting your cycles and you start to actually see that, wow, you know, I knew my job was stressful, but now I'm seeing, like, you know, stress signs on my chart, you know, scant mucus, short luteal phase, delayed ovulation, you know, premenstrual spotting, for example. And then in the month that I was on vacation, I didn't see any of those things. And so for many women, this is one of the first opportunities to have this tangible evidence of what's happening in your body and how much power we actually have to affect our own health in a system that tells us that if we're sick, we just need medication, or that, you know, every illness must be genetic. It had to be family illness. Like, you have no agency, you have no control. Many women, you know, will be diagnosed with things and they'll ask their practitioners, like, well, is there anything I can do? Should I be changing my diet? That doesn't have anything to do with it. There's nothing you could do, just take this pill. So for many women, the charting and connecting with their cycle is the first time that they're actually getting this tangible evidence that, wow, first of all, my life is impacting my health and I didn't even know. And second of all, I actually have the power to make positive changes, and I can actually see in my cycles that it makes a difference.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so then that becomes an empowerment. Yes. Of like, oh, wow. And it brings into question everything that they might have been told.
Everything.
Like that, right? So for some, that can be very disconcerting and uncomfortable and not even wanting to go there, right?
Yeah.
And how that would be a response of like, what? All these people, these doctors, these professionals that I've trusted my whole entire life to tell me what's up, and now I'm suddenly, everything they're saying to me is under question, and I'm having doubts about what, you know, now what?
Yeah.
Who can I trust? Who can I go to? And so that's why I tell my clients all the time to start talking to, look at who you're talking to. So like Western medical practitioners, this is the system that has excluded women from medical research deliberately until the 1990s. All right. Whereas medical practitioners, say in the Chinese medicine realm, have been including menstruation as a central part of a diagnostic system and as an important thing to address when there's imbalances for thousands and thousands of years. And that's the same is true for Ayurvedic medicine. Thousands and thousands of years of paying attention to, and granted, these are still under, patriarchal societal systems in China and India. It's not that women are given, equal rights or anything like that at all. But at least the medical system itself has included menstruation as an important thing to look at. Whereas Western medical doctors have deliberately not done that, right? And so then we can consider who we're talking to as to what might be a healthy source of information. Then, of course, midwives and doulas and naturopathic doctors are also including menstruation and, hormone balance and all these things we've been talking about as an important aspect of health.
Well, I remember I interviewed a doctor once.
Mm-hmm.
And it's been a while, so I don't remember word for word or anything, but I remember asking him something to the effect, because I was trying, as an interview, you ask questions because you're trying to get certain information, right? And so I was asking him a question because I wanted him to weigh in, are you going to get essentially better care from a naturopath or a medical doctor? And I think he said something like, well, if I'm going to a medical doctor, I think it's important to be a little bit concerned. And if I'm going to a naturopath, it's important to be a little bit concerned. And that's not exactly what he said, but he was basically getting at the point that you can have excellent care from a medical doctor who specializes in functional medicine and who understands the hormonal side of what you're dealing with and who has specialized training, say in nutrition and health and hormones and how it all relates to your fertility. So it's possible to go to a medical doctor and have an amazing, useful, healing exchange.
Yes,
and it's also possible to go to a naturopath and to be provided with a list of supplements that destroys your wallet and not feel that the root cause was necessarily addressed. And so I think what I have taken from that over the years is that we can't list these professions as you go to this person, like this profession, and all of your problems are going to be solved. Because if I've learned anything from interviewing, hundreds of professionals in different fields, it's not the profession. There's plenty of naturopaths that don't necessarily specialize as deeply into menstrual cycle issues, whereas others have devoted their entire practice to that. So what I think is more important is to, as you said, really start to understand the modality. You do want to understand the modality that you're working towards. If you're going to a medical doctor, you do have to understand that medical doctor in their toolboxes tends to be medication, surgery, that tends to be their thing. So if you have menstrual cycle issues and you go to a traditional doctor, not trained in the functional side, typically you're going to be given the pill. If you have period pain, you're going to be given painkillers. If you have heavy bleeding, the pill. If you have irregular cycles, the pill. If you have no cycles, the pill. The pill is everything. And that's what they have in their toolbox. But what I would suggest to look for are people who specialize. If you have an issue with your thyroid, you want to find someone who specializes in thyroid. And you don't want to assume that just because someone is a functional doctor or a naturopath or whatever, that they're necessarily going to have all the answers. You want to make sure that you find someone who specializes. And I suggest for you to interview them and to have a conversation and to be really clear about the type of care that you want. And also, I'll get off my soapbox, but I promise. But the one thing also is that you don't want to get into the situation where you assume that any one provider will ever have all of the answers. I really advocate for having a kind of a team approach because we all need doctors. So you want to find a really good doctor, but you can't expect your doctor to do everything. Just like we have a dentist for our teeth, like you don't expect to go to one person for everything. You go to a massage therapist if you've got, so we have to have that kind of balanced idea in our mind where there's no one practitioner that's going to magically solve all your problems.
Right. And then the ultimate center of command, if you will, on this team is right here.
That's right.
We have the most information inside of us, and we have the sensations that are telling us, and we have the intuition that's telling us, and then it's ultimately our responsibility to do the extra research, because a lot of practitioners are just going to go by what their practice. You know, one of my mentors, Aviva Ram, talks about how medical research might be out there, like you were able to find all this research, but it can take up to 20 years, 17 to 20 years for that research that has basically, that's suggesting a big change in the standard practice. Example around pap smears, the frequency of pap smears. She was talking about this, that the research came back that said actually, you know, yearly pap smears is actually more detrimental than beneficial. And it's taken, you know, 17 to 19 years for that change in recommended standard practice to take effect across the board. So if your medical practitioner, whatever modality, whether it's naturopath, even acupuncture, whatever, but they're not doing pap smears, but in any case, they might not be up to date on the best research. So what you said is really perfect. We can't give our power away to these practitioners by just relying on one or expecting them to take care of our health when it's really rests within us to take care of that. And that's difficult in this day and age, especially in this country, in the US, where the healthcare system, I mean, you know, and we're talking about people of a certain degree of financial privilege.
Yeah, and also the ability to understand. And so this isn't an easy position to be in. I mean, I have a lot of knowledge and experience, and, you know, and I've had a number of difficult exchanges with medical providers. So I'm the first one to say that advocating for yourself isn't easy. It's just that it's important to, I use the boardroom analogy, where you picture yourself at the head of the table, and then your health providers are all sitting around this table. So you might have your doctor, you might have your naturopath, you might have your chiropractor, you might have your, you know, health coach, your fertility awareness instructor, whoever. And then you are at the head of the table. And at the end of the day, it's what you said. One of the benefits that I found for myself and for the vast majority of my clients is that when you chart your cycles and you're starting to write down the changes that are happening in your cycle, and you're starting to connect those changes and different events with things that are happening in your life, and you start to see this correlation. For a lot of women, we've been disconnected not only from our bodies, but from our intuition, as you were talking about. And so it's like it gives us evidence to trust our intuition. Mm-hmm. It's like, and then when you start to track certain things, I think when you start tracking anything, you start paying more attention. So maybe you'll start paying attention to when those migraines are happening, or which months out of the year am I having this really heavy bleeding? What was happening, you know, previous to those months? If I'm like, you know, if you're not having the heavy bleeding every single cycle, the cycles that I am having it, you know, what was happening there? And then when you approach your provider, if you have a negative exchange, if that provider is ignoring what you're saying, if they're not listening to you, if they're minimizing you, if they're telling you you're crazy, if they're telling you the pill is the only solution, whatever, then you then have developed more agency, more confidence, and really connected more with your intuition, so such that you might have the confidence that you didn't have before to say, look, this doesn't feel right. I have to trust my body, because now it's not just in my head, it's on this piece of paper. I know that it's not, and it keeps happening. I have all of this evidence to show that there's something wrong and my doctor isn't believing me. And sometimes that's what it takes for you to get the courage to fire your doctor, to find somebody else, to find a different doctor, to stop accepting a substandard level of care from your healthcare providers and demand better.
Yes.
Okay, fully jumped on that soapbox. Couldn't help it. I think I'll just stay on it. I can't stop. I can't get off of it.
Well, just the way you say that is so strong and so affirming, that just made me feel like getting on that soapbox with you.
Well, because it's really hard. This is coming from the experience of personally having to advocate for myself many times over the years, but also through supporting clients. And, you know, sometimes I'm supporting clients after they've been dismissed by medical providers multiple times. I think I've heard more stories than most about, for example, adverse reactions to hormonal birth control, and not being believed, and having to go to multiple doctors and have multiple treatments before anyone takes you seriously. And it would be one thing if those experiences were not common, but they are very common. When you talk about the history and scientific experiments not being done on women, there's a history of women not being believed. I mean, the whole word hysterectomy and hysterical, they used to take women's uteri. They used to remove them because of women having certain emotional, like, there's just a long history of women not being believed, not being taken seriously. And the only way to really get the care we need is to find the courage to demand better. That's
absolutely. And, we were going to talk about trauma, although we're kind of trailing to the end of our time here, but I'll just mention that without even needing to mention all the heaps of other kinds of traumas that might go on in our lives, just the fact that we might not be able to get the care that we need from our medical care practitioners, that alone, it can be traumatizing. Just the fact that we might not be listened to or acknowledged for our own internal wisdom, that alone can be traumatizing. And that's not just in the medical field, that's sort of a systematic relationship dynamic that we as women have to navigate on a day-to-day basis, some more than others if you're also Black or Native American or Mexican in this country or any other non-white person, right? You have to navigate that all the time. And that alone is like these little micro traumas that we talk about. And then that affects our core vitality, which is, I feel, what I like to call the womb is the source of our core vitality. And as that's diminished, then our womb starts to show up with symptoms, and then we try to go and get care, and then there it is happening again.
Yeah.
Right?
And then there's your personal trauma, there's your family trauma, so what's stored from our ancestors.
Exactly.
And then there's the collective female trauma.
That's right.
Of all of the abuse and the pain and the burning at the stake and the history of just the horrible things that so depending on where you stand with your belief in the emotional aspects that impact us, a doctor is an authority figure. There would have been time when we could have gotten into serious trouble for potentially even been injured physically or worse for disagreeing or talking back to an authority figure. So there's a lot of unpacking to do, and that's why it takes a lot of courage. That's why it's difficult. And I think we can just be gentle with ourselves, try to acknowledge to the best as we can. And I mean, because it's what I do and because I've seen the power that it can have, I do feel that connecting with your cycles is a first step. It's not the only thing, but it helps. What I've seen it do for my clients is just it helps you to get out of your head and to start to see that this is real. It's not in your head. If you were experiencing emotional symptoms on birth control and there's so much as women, we're just like, there's this history of being gaslighted as if it's all in our head and it's not real. And so for me, I feel like one of the main roles that I play in women's lives is to help them bring these emotions and the feelings that they've been feeling into the realm of reality. Like it's not in your head. And it's so important as women for us to be believed and to be supported in the ways that we deserve to be supported, for us to get the care that we need, and for us to recognize that if we're not getting that care, we do deserve it. And if that's not happening, we have the right to get the care somewhere else.
Absolutely. I'm so grateful that you're doing this work because, bringing all the research, right, the authoritative research together, that is a piece of work I'm so grateful that you did. I'm sure that it was many long days and nights poring over
2 years
of not very interesting times, information.
Wow. I'm a nerd, so I definitely but I totally hear what you're saying.
Yeah. It could be dry. I'm sure it could be dry, you know?
Yes, it can.
But you got to totally geek out with it. So I appreciate that about you. And those of you listening, The Fifth Vital Sign by Lisa Hendrickson-Jack. I can't recommend it more highly. I will recommend it as highly as I can. And so please check it out. And thank you once again, Lisa, for joining us on the Womb-Centered Healing podcast. Is there a way, besides looking for your book on Amazon, that someone could connect with you if they wanted to learn more about your work?
Yes, you can find more from me at the Fertility Friday podcast. So wherever your favorite podcast player, you can just search Fertility Friday. And I am pretty active most of the time on Instagram at Fertility Friday. I share a lot about birth control and generally, supporting women's health. And I'd like to thank you, Sama, for bringing me on, and as we work towards smashing the patriarchy together.
Dismantling the
the issues, we could go on, but I just really appreciate the opportunity. This conversation was important that we had.
Yes, it was. And I like to talk about returning to a partnership model of relationship between men and women. Because we say things like smashing the patriarchy, it brings up all this fear in men that we're.
But I still like to say that. But yes,
I do.
We should be more supportive, etc.
I just like to clarify that because we want a partnership. We don't.
We do.
Matriarchy, which is the opposite of the patriarchy, where anything not female is suppressed. We don't want that. That would just be the same, right?
No.
We want a partnership. And so just to end on that note of working towards that, even if some smashing needs to happen along the way. So thanks so much. And again, if you want to learn more about womb-centered healing, you can come to wombcenteredhealing.com. And that's all for now. Take good care.